So I'm going to be talking about three things in particular: the Met's new violence suppression units, tasers, and newly introduced serious violence reduction orders. And I'm going to start off by talking about the Met's new violence suppression units, which were introduced in the midst of the coronavirus, in the first coronavirus lockdown, which is interesting because crime was actually decreasing during this period. And there are 12 violence suppression units across London, comprised of 620 officers in total, and they engage in intelligence gathering, raids, weapon sweeps, and stop and search. They have termed the areas they police as microbeats, framed as areas where gangs, drugs, and violence have flourished, and they police 250 microbeats around London. Essentially, what this means is that violence suppression units are framed as having the primary purpose of tackling gang violence. But because the government, the police, and the media have consistently over decades constructed gang violence as an issue specific to the Black community, what has seemingly ended up happening is that violence suppression units, or VSUs as I'll call them from now on, are predominantly deployed in areas where Black people live, essentially operating as a type of spatialized racial profiling. So just to give you an idea of what this actually looks like in practice, ITV accompanied a VSU and filmed the whole experience, and the footage shows a VSU vans pulling up to an estate in Barking, East London, and VSU officers jumping out to question and seemingly harass the Black men hanging out there, who the police assume are potential criminals because of their race and locale. Channel 4 also accompanied the VSU and filmed it. On Channel 4's excursion, the VSU carried out a stop on two young Black Muslim men in a car, which turns out to be the result of a mistaken identity. Despite the error, the police go on to handcuff the two men and search the car for 10 minutes, after which they find nothing. In the next scene, the VSU targets a South London estate and handcuffs a 17-year-old child in care reported as missing. The child's identity is blurred, but you can see that they're a BME background, and once again, no offences were evident. What's really interesting is that specialist squads of the same name, violence suppression units, have existed in California for many, many, many years prior to their emergence in the UK. So VSUs in California go back to 1994 at the very least, and VSUs in America are also framed as having the primary objective of tackling gang violence. And they too engage in the same tactics as VSUs in London: stop and search, intelligence gathering, and raids. Which presents the obvious question: could it be that our VSUs in London, established in 2020, are actually modelled on California VSUs? Anticlimactically, I can't actually definitively prove whether or not this is the case, but it is possible to contextualise the emergence of the Met's VSUs in the wider landscape of British and American policing. So to this effect, we can say that the UK's current police anti-gang initiatives already existed in the US prior to the early 2000s. So I'm just going to outline a few examples of this. In the US, police anti-gang specialist squads proliferated during the 1980s. Gang databases, which are databases of suspected gang members, were established shortly afterwards. Gang injunctions, which are court orders preventing suspected gang members from participating in a whole host of activities, came about in 1982. And facial recognition technology and its use in conjunction with law enforcement has been in use since the 2000s. Whereas in the UK, all of these things only really came about after 2011. The reason for this was that in 2011, Mark Duggan, a 29-year-old mixed-race black man, was shot dead by police in Tottenham, and all those that partook in the uprisings which followed were classed as gangs. So in the days after the uprisings, David Cameron declared an all-out war on gangs and gang culture. And as a consequence, we now have specialist anti-gang squads, such as the VSU, but also things like Trident Gang Command, our own gangs database, known as the Gangs Matrix. We also have gang injunctions, and we also have facial recognition technology, which operates together with watch lists. Watch lists are basically a list of individuals of interest to the Met. And if we look more into the US-UK policing relationship, and this is something that Jazz pointed out to me, we can point to the fact that after the 2011 uprisings, David Cameron tried to appoint controversial American figure Bill Bratton as Metropolitan Police Commissioner. Bill Bratton was the former New York and Los Angeles Police Commissioner, and he was a staunch proponent of heavy-handed policing. And he helped the police department move further into Black and Latino communities, which was linked to the mass incarceration of these communities. And then in 2011, at Bill Bratton's suggestion, senior Met officers traveled to New York to observe how NYPD tackles gang violence. And then way back in 2009, Bill Bratton was awarded a CBE for his work to promote cooperation between US and UK police. So all in all, we don't have the smoking gun to say that London's VSUs are based on American VSUs, but the evidence seems to point to the fact that yes, British gang policing is to some extent modeled after the American version. And what would it mean if this was in fact the case? Most likely nothing too positive, as American gang policing has been so heavily critiqued for its inaccurate definition of gangs, intrinsic racism as they disproportionately target Black and Latino communities, except they've also been critiqued for their excessively violent and harassing nature and their inefficacy in decreasing gang violence to the extent that many American gang policing methods have either been suspended or terminated. What also provides great cause for concern is that in America, immigration and gang policing work together so that communities of color become doubly targeted. Essentially, what this has meant is that for many decades, the US has introduced policies to make certain offenses, such as the attempt to commit a drug crime, as a deportable offense, while allegations of gang affiliations have been used to deport people. In the UK, the convergence of immigration and gang policing is in its comparatively early stages, and it's most clearly seen through Operation Nexus, which involves UK police forces working together with the Home Office Immigration Enforcement to target what they call high harm foreign national offenders, including gang members, for deportation. But looking into the future, I imagine that there will be an acceleration in the development of collaborative immigration and gang policing ventures in the UK. And now I'm going to move on to talk about tasers, and it's interesting to note that, sorry, is there a problem? This is a question. I can come back to it later after I finish. There's something you didn't understand. And now if I move on to talk about tasers, it's interesting to note that tasers appeared in the US before they appeared in the UK. Tasers were introduced to LA Police Department in 1974. And in 2017, Reuters said that there were at least 1,005 deaths in the US involving tasers. On the other hand, tasers were introduced to the UK in 2003 to fill the gap between the baton and the gun as a less lethal weapon, specifically for use by firearms officers. Then, if we skip forward to 2019, Northamptonshire Police became the first force to arm all frontline officers with a weapon, and other forces promptly followed suit. Then last year in 2020, the Home Office announced that police forces across England and Wales would receive 7 million to purchase 8,000 more tasers. So in short, what we're witnessing is not just a massive increase in the number of officers carrying tasers, but also a decreasing restrictions concerning which officers can carry and use the weapon. And who does this affect the most? We know that because of structural racism, which includes the persistence of racial stereotypes equating Blackness with criminality, because of the policing of Black communities and institutional racism in the police force, that tasers disproportionately impact Black people across the UK. So within the last year or so, there's been some really controversial use of tasers against Black men across the country, and I'm just going to briefly read out a few of these cases. So in London, 23-year-old Jordan Walker Brown was tasered as he was jumping over a wall, leaving him paralysed from the waist down. In Greater Manchester, Desmond Ziggy Mambayara was tasered in front of his young son, who screams "Daddy" in utter distress as he watches his father being tasered and fall to the ground. In Birmingham, 30-year-old Travell Wise, an innocent bystander, was tasered in the throat. And in London, 62-year-old Millar Scott was tasered in his own home. Taking all of these incidents into account, we see how tasers contribute to existing police practices, such as stop and search, which induce trauma principally within the Black community, compounding existing racial trauma. Kids of Colour, which is an organisation in Manchester that challenges racism, collected people's responses on viewing the footage of Desmond Ziggy Mambayara being tasered in front of his son. I'm just going to read out one mother's response now, which addresses the issue of collective trauma in the Black community. She said, "As a mother, I would like to say that it has really traumatized me. It's made me feel, as a mother of 3 Black sons, aged 21, 15, and 10, that there's no protection or support for them. I just feel very scared and fragile at a time like this, that certain systems are not taking accountability of these behaviors. We keep seeing these behaviors over and over again, and the trauma it has for our children and young boys in the community. We need to find a better way that police are responding to young Black males. It's out of hand, it's disrespectful. My son is really upset by it, he's 15. There has also been significant controversy over the growing use of tasers against those with mental health problems. In 2017 alone, tasers were used against mental health patients in healthcare settings 96 times. And if we are to think about intersectionality, which means looking at how different aspects of people's identities can intersect to compound inequality, we must acknowledge how Black people are overrepresented in mental health statistics and mental health systems, rendering them even more vulnerable to the weapon and the trauma it can engender. And part of the reason for which tasers are so traumatizing is because of their bodily impact. I personally don't believe that is well known fact, but tasers do cause severe and acute pain. And actually, as early as 2007, the UN Committee Against Torture determined that the pain inflicted by tasers is so intense that it can be considered a form of torture. Despite this, in the summer of 2020, at the height of the Black Lives Matter protest, Priti Patel announced that a new and more painful taser, called the Taser 7, was to be introduced to police forces in England and Wales. Tasers' impact on the body can also result in long-term and permanent consequences. For example, it's worth here referring back to the case of Jordan Walker-Brown, who is now paralysed from the waist down. And of course, speaking of the permanent bodily impact, we must acknowledge the 18 people that have died after being tasered in the UK since 2003. And these deaths also contradict the Met's definition of a taser as a less lethal weapon. I'm just going to move on and finish by talking about serious violence reduction orders in the UK. So the highly controversial police crime sentencing and courts bill reintroduced to Parliament contains provisions for a significant extension in the use of police stop and search powers under new serious violence reduction orders, which I'll call SVROs from now on. And those who are subject to SVROs will be marked out to be stopped and searched at any time and in any public place, essentially without the normal requirement for the police officer to have reasonable grounds for suspecting that the person is in possession of a knife or other offensive weapon. And although suspicionless stops and searches can be authorised under Section 60, Section 60 stops are limited to both the time period and specific location where they can be used, whereas SVROs will last for a minimum of 6 months and for a maximum of 2 years, whereby they can be renewed and extended, and they can be used in any police area of the country. What is really important is that the police crime sentencing and courts bill also allow for an SVRO to be issued in situations where a person is found likely to have known or ought to have known that another person would be in possession of a knife or offensive weapon in the commission of an offence. So this idea echoes joint enterprise, a legal rule that means that any group member can be convicted of a crime regardless of whether they committed it. So for example, if somebody used a bladed article to commit murder, under joint enterprise, another person or more than one person could also be convicted of murder. And there's some really horrific cases where joint enterprise has been used to convict people to life sentences for offences where they weren't even present at the scene of the crime. And unsurprisingly, joint enterprise has disproportionately affected Black and marginalised groups, and this is what we would expect to see from SVROs too. And this is especially because knife crime has been racialised as a Black issue, despite the fact that, for example, it's only 1% of the total young Black London population that is involved in serious youth violence. And the government readily admits that SVROs will disproportionately impact Black people. They said, it might be that a disproportionate number of Black people are impacted, Black adult males in particular. In addition, we know that Black people were 9.7 times as likely to be stopped as those who are white. This may mean that people from an ethnic minority who are subject to an SVRO are more likely to be searched in practice. End quote. This will mean that the consequences of SVROs, which range from the severe restriction of your freedom of movement over an extended period of time, the risk of persistent police harassment, the undermining of your ability to rehabilitate and reintegrate into the community, as well as the ability to access employment, education, and other opportunities, all of these consequences will disproportionately impact Black people. So to conclude, British policing continues to pose a growing number of challenges and threats, especially to racialised communities, and the struggle and the fight continues. Thank you.